My previous video on logic was short, really short, just 30 seconds, and there's a reason I went for that time frame. And it wasn't just so it would qualify as a YouTube short. Honestly, I don't see this as being the type of video that would be popular on YouTube Shorts anyway. Instead, the reason I wanted it short was because that is literally how simple logic is. That one law of logic, the law of identity, is the only thing you need to believe in order for the rest of logic to follow. Identity, A is A. Whatever A is, that is what it is. And whatever it is not, that is not what A is. From that small kernel, the totality of logic is built. A is A. Something is what it is. And while I didn't explicitly call it out in my previous video, the second law of logic is also included in the law of identity. That's the law of non-contradiction. In my opinion, this really isn't a separate law at all. But in any case, the law of non-contradiction is A is not non-A. In my mind, there's no step between saying A is A and saying A is not non-A, because that's just another way of stating the same thing. The reason I choose to use the law of identity instead of the law of non-contradiction is because identity is a positive definition. It tells us what something is. Non-contradiction is a negative definition. It tells us what something is not. Now, there's nothing necessarily wrong with a negative definition, but it's usually far better to describe something by its positive aspects instead of its negative aspects. To give you an illustration of what I mean, suppose you wanted to define a chair. It is far easier to define a chair by what it is than by what it is not. Try to define a chair by what it is not, and you'll be here all day. It's not a cow. It's not a building. It's not a political movement. It's not the droids you're looking for. On the other hand, explaining what it is both easier and far more useful. It's an object used to sit on. Naturally, that's a really basic concept of what a chair is, and we can add more to it. But already, the fact that we know at least one function of what a chair is gives us way more information than listing out dozens of things that a chair is not. So, for the same reason, I tend to use the positive definitions when it comes to logic. And the law of identity, A is A, is the positive definition of the law of non-contradiction. A is not non-A. But so far, we haven't discussed anything at all about what A is when we talk about A is A. That's because, in an abstract sense, it doesn't matter. A can be anything. It's a universal variable here. The problem is, we're going to need to get into particulars if we want to progress to the point where logic is useful in everyday life. So let's begin there. Just why is logic important anyway? Or to phrase it in a better way, I hope, what is logic supposed to do? Knowing its purpose will help us know how and why we should use it. After all, it's important for us to get this figured out before we dig in too deep. Many people think logic is designed to tell us what is or isn't true, but that's not actually what logic does. Rather, logic is designed to tell us whether or not a conclusion is valid. And to be valid, something just needs to follow the rules of logic. You can evaluate things you know to be false and still find out that the conclusions drawn from those falsehoods are still valid in logic. So just because something is valid doesn't mean you should accept it as true. For that reason, we differentiate between validity and soundness. Again, arguments are valid if they follow the rules of logic, but they are sound if they are also true. Basically, you want your arguments to be sound, not just valid. If you plan on convincing others of your point of view, that is. Because of the existence of sound logical arguments, then logic can lead to conclusions that are true, but only if we start with things that are true. Logic itself will not tell us whether or not those starting points are true, but it will tell us whether or not our conclusions are valid if we assume the starting points are true. So basically, logic is a validity test, and it is your responsibility to make sure the input you're feeding into it is true to begin with. So if logic is a validity test, then the next question we need to ask is, what exactly do we mean by A when we say A is A? Previously I said it doesn't matter, and that's because functionally, within the statement of A is A, it doesn't matter what A is, only that it is what it is. Now at this point, I could just remain in what is called formal logic. Formal in this case doesn't mean it dresses up for the prom, but instead that we are dealing with the forms of logic. Forms deal with the relationships between things, and we intentionally keep it abstracted in order to focus on what comes about from the form of an argument rather than the details. In that regard, formal logic operates very similarly to number theory. We can learn a great deal simply by analyzing the patterns and implications of the rules of logic, just as we can learn about a lot of abstract mathematical concepts in number theory. But in the end, if we want to use our mathematical insights to design a bridge, we're going to have to figure out how to inject mathematics into physics or engineering or something else that is practical. In the same way, formal logic gets you a long way, but in order for it to be meaningful, we're going to have to convert it into what is called propositional logic. In other words, when we get beyond the form of logic, we want to examine what logic operates on in the quote-unquote real world, and that is propositions. Naturally, that immediately raises the question of, well, what is a proposition then? I know there's a lot of definitions here, but this is the last one. Simply put, a proposition is a declarative sentence with an objective truth value. To unpack that, it means that a proposition, first of all, is a sentence with content, and that content needs to have the ability to be either true or false, but it cannot be both true and false at the same time. The reason this is important is because many people will mistake opinions for propositions. For example, chocolate is the best flavor of ice cream. Now, this is certainly a declarative statement, but it does not have an objective truth value. Some people will agree with its veracity, but some people, maybe even most people, given the plethora of flavors out there, will disagree that it is true. If someone says chocolate is the best flavor of ice cream, it would therefore be absurd to respond that's illogical, because logic doesn't care about opinions. It has nothing to do with this. See, opinions have no objective truth value associated with them. That's actually why they are opinions and not facts. So that is why logic doesn't operate on them. On the other hand, saying something like the planet Saturn exists is a declarative statement that has a truth value. It either is true that the planet Saturn exists, or it is false that the planet Saturn exists. It cannot be both true and false. It is one or the other, and whether it is true or not does not depend on the subjective views of other people, but on the objective reality of whether the planet is there or not. Therefore, this is a statement of fact, not opinion, and the declarative statement, the planet Saturn exists, is a proposition that can be used in logic. So with that in mind, as we proceed in our discussions, I am going to use a mixture of formal logic, which is useful for learning the various rules of logic and how they interrelate with each other, and propositional logic, where we will actually find out how to use logic in a practical and worthwhile manner. So stay tuned for those, and in the meantime, have a wonderful day, and peace out.